The courtroom was a battlefield of silence, every eye glued to the proceedings. Tension hung in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. The clock ticked louder than usual, each second crawling by as the prosecution laid out their case, filled with calculated precision and a sense of inevitability. The defense had seemed like just another formal step in a well-worn process. But this was different. Judge Richard Posner, a man who had seen his fair share of trials, sat at the bench, his face unreadable. He'd heard every argument, every objection, every legal maneuver imaginable. Nothing surprised him anymore. Or so he thought. Jasmine Crockett stood before him, her presence calm, but beneath that calm, there was a storm brewing. The pressure was mounting, the stakes impossibly high. Her hands, slightly trembling, gripped the podium as she prepared to speak. The prosecutor had just finished his case, assured, confident, as if the verdict were already written. But Jasmine wasn't just going to follow the script. The courtroom waited in collective breathlessness as she finally spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about what you've heard from the prosecution. It's about something deeper. It's about the very foundation of justice itself. She paused. The words hung in the air, and the murmurs rippled through the room, but she didn't stop. With deliberate care, she continued. What you've been told is a story written by those who believe they control the narrative. But what if I told you that story is built on lies? There was an audible gasp from the gallery. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Posner's gaze flickered for the briefest moment, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but just enough for anyone watching to see the shift. His expression, usually one of impassive control, betrayed the hint of disbelief. He wasn't the only one. Jasmine's voice rose, gaining strength with every word. I'm not here to defend the guilty. I'm here to defend the truth. A beat. And then the world seemed to pause. Judge Posner leaned forward, his eyes widening. This wasn't the defense anyone had expected. This was going to change everything. Jasmine's words echoed through the courtroom, but they were just the beginning. As the room held its breath, the enormity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a trial. It wasn't just about one defendant or one case. This was something far bigger, a collision of values that would determine not only the fate of an individual, but the future of an entire community, and perhaps even the very ideals that America was built upon. For Jasmine Crockett, this was personal. It wasn't just her career on the line, it was the very essence of justice. She had seen the system up close, the cracks in the facade, the deep-seated corruption that ran through the heart of it all. It was a system that didn't always work for the people it was meant to protect, a system that all too often favored those with power, wealth, and influence. She had spent her life fighting against that very system. And now, standing in this courtroom, she knew this case was her moment to expose it for what it was. Her mind flashed to the countless conversations she had had with families, immigrants, people whose lives had been shattered by an unfair system. She had heard their stories, their struggles. They had placed their trust in her, believing she was their last hope for justice. But this trial, this one, was different. It was the kind of case that could change everything. The prosecutor, with his polished suit and smug smile, represented everything Jasmine had come to despise. He wasn't just there to win a case. He was there to maintain the status quo, to defend a broken system that did more harm than good. And the stakes were high. If the prosecution succeeded, it would send a message that justice, in this country, was still reserved for the powerful. It would reinforce the idea that the law could be manipulated to protect the interests of the few, leaving the most vulnerable to suffer. But if Jasmine could win, if she could expose the truth and prove the corruption at the core of this case, it would be a victory not just for the defendant, but for the entire nation. It would send a message that the law was not a tool to be wielded by the powerful for their gain, but a shield to protect the innocent, to ensure fairness and equality for all. It would be a turning point, a moment where the scales of justice finally tipped in favor of those who had been silenced for too long. The tension in the room was palpable as the prosecutor stood up, adjusting his tie with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His voice cut through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented the facts. We have shown you the evidence. The defense will attempt to distract you with stories and rhetoric. But let us be clear, this case is about one thing, the truth." Jasmine's eyes never left the prosecutor. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her. The pressure was crushing, but she stood tall, resolute. This wasn't just a battle over facts, this was a battle for justice itself. She knew that with every argument, with every counterpoint, she was walking a tightrope. One misstep, and everything could fall apart. The media was watching. The public was watching. And more importantly, the people who had been left behind by the system were watching. Outside the courtroom, the stakes were even higher. The case had already drawn national attention, and it was clear that the verdict would resonate far beyond the walls of this room. Communities across the country, marginalized communities, immigrant communities, were hoping for a victory, hoping that someone, somewhere, was willing to fight for them. Jasmine couldn't let them down. She couldn't let the system win this time. As the prosecutor's words hung in the air, Jasmine prepared herself for what came next. This trial wasn't just about winning, it was about rewriting the narrative, about showing the world that justice, real justice, still had a place in America. The future of a whole community was hanging in the balance. The weight of it was immense, but Jasmine was ready to carry it. The prosecutor, James Walker, had built his career on certainty. He was a man who understood the system, not just in theory but in practice. He knew the rules, the loopholes, and the unspoken truths that lurked just beneath the surface of every legal battle. He was the embodiment of the establishment, polished, calculating, and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. Years of winning cases, no matter how messy or morally ambiguous, had created a sense of entitlement in him, a belief that he was always right, that his power was beyond challenge. Walker had a history of making the difficult look easy. His success in the courtroom wasn't just about his legal acumen, it was about his ability to manipulate the system. He knew how to spin a narrative, how to twist the truth until it bent in his favor. The public admired him for his relentless pursuit of justice, but behind closed doors, it was clear that Walker had little regard for the ethics of his profession. He was a product of a system that rewarded his ruthlessness, his willingness to push the boundaries of legality for the sake of victory. He'd played the game for so long that he had begun to believe he was above reproach. When the case against the defendant landed on his desk, Walker saw an opportunity. This wasn't just any trial, it was a chance to further cement his reputation, to prove once again that he was untouchable. He'd heard of Jasmine Crockett, of course. The young, idealistic lawyer who had risen through the ranks with a reputation for standing up for the underdog. But in Walker's eyes, she was just another rookie. Another naive attorney who believed that truth could overcome the realities of a broken system. To Walker, Jasmine's defense was laughable. He'd seen it all before, the impassioned speeches, the emotional appeals, the well-meaning but misguided attempts to level the playing field. He'd crushed dozens of lawyers like her, and this case, he believed, would be no different. After all, what could someone like her, someone who still believed in the idea of fairness and justice, possibly know about the hard, cold reality of the courtroom? Walker didn't even consider the possibility that he could lose. His arrogance was a shield that blinded him to the real stakes. He assumed that the jury would fall in line, that his evidence would speak for itself, that his years of experience would be more than enough to bury any attempt at counterargument. But what he didn't account for was the power of someone who was willing to fight not just for the law, but for the people the law had failed. What he didn't understand was that Jasmine wasn't just defending her client, she was defending something far greater, the idea that the law should work for everyone, not just the privileged few. For all his confidence, Walker was blind to his own weaknesses. He was a product of the very system he so expertly manipulated, and in his heart, he knew it. He knew that his victories hadn't come from pure merit, but from his ability to bend the truth and outsmart those who couldn't navigate the shadows of the law. He was a master at playing the game, but deep down, he feared what would happen if someone ever truly exposed it for what it was. Jasmine Crockett was that someone. She had studied Walker's methods long before she set foot in the courtroom. She knew how he operated, how he could twist facts and leverage his power to suppress the truth. But she wasn't like the other lawyers he'd faced. She wasn't going to let him manipulate the jury with smoke and mirrors. And what drove her even more than justice was her belief that the system could be better, fairer, and that people like Walker were the reason it wasn't. Walker, however, was still convinced that he had the upper hand. As he stood up to deliver his opening statement, his smug confidence radiated through the room. He turned to the jury, offering them a smile that bordered on condescending. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we have here is simple. A defendant who thought they could outsmart the law, and a defense attorney who believes that truth alone can overcome decades of legal precedent." He paused for a moment, scanning the jury. They were just faces to him, interchangeable, a means to an end. "There's nothing remarkable about this case," Walker continued, his voice dripping with certainty. "The law is clear. The evidence is undeniable. And the facts, well, the facts speak for themselves." The arrogance in his voice was palpable. But what he didn't see, the fatal flaw in his thinking, was that he had underestimated the one thing that had never played by the rules he understood, Jasmine Crockett. While Walker had become comfortable in his predictable success, Jasmine had spent her life challenging the system, confronting the people like him who believed that power and influence could silence the truth. Walker didn't think much of Jasmine. To him, she was just another young attorney with idealistic dreams, someone he could crush in the courtroom, a mere stepping stone in his path to greater power. But what he didn't realize was that, in his arrogance, he had made a grave mistake. He had overlooked the one thing that made Jasmine different, her unshakable belief in justice. As the trial progressed, Walker's confidence remained unshaken. He still thought he had all the answers. But the one thing he hadn't accounted for, his greatest flaw, was that in his world of certainty, he had forgotten how to see the cracks. And soon, those cracks would be his undoing. Jasmine Crockett had never been handed anything in life. Born into adversity, she had fought for every inch of success. She wasn't the product of privilege, nor had she ever known the luxury of security. Her childhood had been a constant battle, one she had fought alongside her mother, a woman whose strength could rival the might of any force. Raised in the heart of a neighborhood where dreams were often stifled by the weight of poverty, Jasmine learned early on that success was never a given. It was something you had to carve out for yourself. Her mother, a single parent, worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment running. Jasmine remembered the way her mother's hands would tremble when she set down her paycheck, as if the weight of their lives rested on it. But there was always a smile, always hope in her mother's eyes, even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. Jasmine admired her resilience, but she also knew that the life her mother had fought so hard for could be easily taken away by the very system that was supposed to protect them. It was a system that often turned a blind eye to those like them, the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. From a young age, Jasmine understood that the rules weren't always fair. She saw her neighbors, people she knew and loved, punished for things that others would easily escape, things like poverty, race, and circumstance. But Jasmine had something that none of them had, a fierce determination. She wasn't going to let her future be defined by the limitations imposed on her by the world around her. Every time she was knocked down, she rose again. Every door that was slammed in her face only pushed her to fight harder for the next one. It wasn't long before she realized the one thing that could change everything, knowledge. Education became her weapon, her armor against the world's injustice. She excelled in school, driven not only by a thirst for knowledge but by a deep desire to escape the cycle of poverty. Books became her sanctuary, a place where the world's limitations faded, and possibilities blossomed. But even with her academic success, Jasmine's journey was never smooth. She was often the only black woman in her classes, and that distinction came with its own set of challenges. Professors, colleagues, and classmates would underestimate her, dismiss her, or make assumptions about her intelligence based solely on her appearance. But Jasmine was never one to be intimidated. She used those moments to fuel her ambition, transforming the bias she faced into fire for her drive. When she earned a full scholarship to a prestigious law school, it wasn't just an academic achievement, it was a personal triumph over a system that had constantly tried to tell her she didn't belong. The law became her passion, not because of its complexity or prestige, but because it was a tool that could either maintain the status quo or shatter it. Jasmine knew she wanted to be the one who used that tool to dismantle the injustices she had witnessed her entire life. Law school was where she truly found her voice. She didn't just want to learn the rules, she wanted to challenge them, to question why certain people were treated as if their lives didn't matter. Her professors were impressed by her intellect, but more than that, they saw something deeper, a relentless drive to make things right. While many students would debate theoretical cases, Jasmine would focus on the real-world implications of every law they studied, seeing them not as abstract concepts, but as living, breathing forces that could either help or hurt people. After law school, Jasmine could have joined a corporate firm, secured a comfortable paycheck, and lived a life of relative ease. But that wasn't who she was. She chose to work with underserved communities, fighting for people whose voices were often ignored. She knew that every case she took on would be a battle, a fight not just for her clients, but for the integrity of the legal system itself. But it wasn't easy. The cases she chose were never the glamorous ones. She defended families who had been unjustly evicted, immigrants facing deportation, and individuals whose lives had been shattered by a system that had never been built to support them. Every day, Jasmine faced opposition, not just from her adversaries in the courtroom but from the biases that had been ingrained in the very system she had vowed to change. But Jasmine didn't back down. She never did. Her reputation grew, not just because of her legal victories, but because of her unwavering commitment to her clients. She would stay up late, sifting through case files, searching for that one piece of evidence that could turn the tide. She built a network of allies, activists, social workers, and community leaders, who believed in her mission and helped amplify her voice. Her victories were hard-earned, but they mattered. Each one was a testament to her refusal to accept the world as it was and her determination to create a world that was better for everyone. When she was approached to take on the case that would define her career, it felt like a culmination of everything she had worked for. But it was also personal. She had seen the defendant's story mirrored in the lives of so many people she had fought for, people whose futures were at the mercy of a system that didn't care about them. Jasmine knew this case wasn't just another file to close. It was a chance to show the world that the law, at its core, was meant to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. As she stood in the courtroom, facing down an opponent who represented everything she despised, Jasmine understood one thing: this was more than a case. This was her moment to rewrite the rules, to show that even when the odds are stacked against you, when the system is designed to silence you, your voice can still be the one that's heard. The air in the courtroom grew thick, almost unbearable. Judge Posner sat back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room, watching as the debate between Jasmine Crockett and the prosecutor reached a boiling point. The stakes were high. The world outside this room was waiting for a verdict, and in this moment, every word, every argument mattered more than ever. Prosecutor James Walker stood tall, his voice dripping with self-assuredness as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense wants to paint a picture of a misunderstood individual, a victim of a corrupt system. But let's be clear, what we have here is not a tragedy of justice, but a calculated crime. The defendant knew exactly what they were doing, and they need to be held accountable. He paused for effect, watching the jury closely, his gaze shifting to Jasmine. There was a glint of arrogance in his eyes as he added, "The defense may tell you a story of innocence, but the facts are irrefutable. And no amount of rhetoric will change that." The prosecutor's words hung in the air, his confidence oozing as he returned to his seat. Jasmine Crockett's calm demeanor was the only contrast to his loud certainty. She stood up slowly, as if every movement was measured, every word weighed. The room fell into a tense hush as she made her way to the podium. Mr. Walker, with all due respect, she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, you've missed the point entirely. What you're asking the jury to believe is not based on evidence, but on assumptions. You're asking them to ignore the very thing that makes this country great, the presumption of innocence. You're not presenting facts, Mr. Walker. You're presenting a narrative, one that is not supported by the evidence at all. Walker's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure, flashing a smug smile as he stood to interject. This is the problem with your approach, Ms. Crockett. You want to turn every trial into a lesson on justice and fairness, but this is a courtroom, not a lecture hall. We deal with facts here. We deal with truth. Jasmine didn't flinch. And the truth, she said, her eyes locking onto Walker's with unwavering conviction, is that the facts you've presented do not add up. You've twisted the evidence, Mr. Walker. You've ignored crucial details that completely change the context of this case. And you're asking the jury to accept a lie because it's easier than confronting the truth. Walker sneered, clearly rattled but trying to mask it with his practiced confidence. Oh, I see. So now we're the ones who don't understand the truth. Tell me, Miss Crockett, if the defendant was so innocent, why are we here today? Why are we wasting the jury's time with these distractions? Jasmine took a deep breath, her posture straightening as she leaned into her response. Because, Mr. Walker, this case isn't about a defendant who's guilty or innocent. It's about a system that's broken, one that presumes guilt based on appearance, based on assumptions, not evidence. You're not defending the law, Mr. Walker. You're defending a narrative that serves your interests, not the interests of justice. The prosecutor's face reddened as he paced back and forth. Justice? Don't talk to me about justice. This is about accountability. This is about making sure that the law is respected, that people are held responsible for their actions. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't back down. Accountability? You want accountability, Mr. Walker? Then let's talk about the system you defend. Let's talk about the police officers who are never held accountable for their actions. Let's talk about the corporate criminals who walk free while the people they've hurt suffer. You're not here to ensure justice. You're here to protect a system that's stacked against the very people who need it the most. The courtroom grew even quieter, the tension in the air palpable. Judge Posner's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping against the armrest as he processed the exchange. This wasn't the back and forth of a typical trial. This was something far more charged, something far more personal. Walker, visibly growing agitated, shot back with a calculated accusation. So now we're supposed to believe that this is some grand conspiracy? That the entire system is rigged against your client? Jasmine's response was swift, measured, and devastating. No, Mr. Walker, I'm not asking the jury to believe in conspiracy. I'm asking them to believe in something far simpler, that the truth matters. I'm asking them to consider the evidence we've presented, not the evidence you've cherry-picked to fit your narrative. And I'm asking them to look at this case for what it really is, a young man's life caught in a system that's failed him at every turn. Walker's smug expression faltered, and for the first time in the trial, he hesitated. His eyes darted to the jury, then to Judge Posner, who was watching the exchange with growing interest. Jasmine's words were landing harder than he had anticipated. She wasn't just challenging his arguments, she was challenging everything he believed in. The room was still. For a moment, no one moved, as if time itself had frozen. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Walker's composure was slipping, and Jasmine had just taken the upper hand. Judge Posner's eyes widened ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in the courtroom. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore, he was invested. The stakes had just been raised. Jasmine's gaze remained steady, her voice calm but resolute as she spoke the final words that would send a ripple of disbelief through the courtroom. This is not just about winning a case, Mr. Walker. This is about justice. And if you think for a second that the truth will be buried under your lies, then you're sadly mistaken. The courtroom was frozen, and every eye was locked on Jasmine. The battle had just begun, but it was clear, the tides had shifted. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words was heavy, suffocating. The courtroom held its collective breath, as though waiting for the very air to move again. Jasmine stood still, poised, every inch of her body radiating calm, but inside, she was focused, laser-sharp. Her eyes never left the prosecutor, who was now visibly flustered, his earlier smugness all but erased. He was fumbling, searching for the next attack, the next accusation, but Jasmine had already anticipated his every move. Judge Posner, for the first time in the trial, was leaning forward, his gaze flicking between the two figures at the center of the storm. He had seen hundreds of trials, heard thousands of arguments, but this was different. This was a battle not just of facts, but of principles. The subtle shift in the room, the stillness, the tense quiet, was unmistakable. The stakes had gone from high to immeasurably higher. The audience, if there was one, would remember this moment. Walker finally regained his composure. He stood up once again, adjusting his tie, his voice filled with an exaggerated calmness. "Ms. Crockett," he began, his tone dripping with patronizing confidence, "you want to talk about truth, but let's be clear. You're creating a fantasy, a narrative that's disconnected from the reality of this case. We have the facts, and we have the law. And unfortunately for your client, that's all that matters here." Jasmine did not flinch. She simply watched him, waiting for the right moment. She knew how to play this game, and she was playing it to perfection. Every word, every pause, every gesture was calculated, designed to pull the rug out from under him when he least expected it. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice as steady as the ocean before a storm. "You're missing the key point. What you've ignored is the very thing that makes this case so critical to our justice system, the pursuit of truth, not the maintenance of a narrative. You stand here, with all your supposed facts, but you've failed to address the one thing that has always been at the heart of this trial, the truth that is inconvenient to your case." The prosecutor's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to fire back, but Jasmine cut him off before he could even speak. "You've relied on the presumption that the system is working, that every piece of evidence you present is infallible. But I'm here to tell you, Mr. Walker, that's not the reality of this case. The reality is that the system you believe in, the one you defend so staunchly, is the very thing that has failed my client and countless others." She took a step forward, every inch of her presence commanding the room. The jury was rapt, leaning in slightly, as if they, too, were on the edge of discovery. Walker's jaw clenched. He could feel the control slipping away, but he held firm. "The truth," Jasmine continued, "is that this case isn't about the defendant's guilt or innocence, as you would have them believe. It's about a deeper question: who does the law serve? Who gets to define what's right and what's wrong? Because I'm standing here in front of you, asking that very question." She paused, her gaze shifting from Walker to the jury, making sure every eye was on her. The power was shifting. She was in control now. "You've presented your evidence. You've made your case, and yes, you've laid out facts, facts that fit your narrative. But what you've left out, Mr. Walker, is the truth. The truth that is buried beneath your selective interpretation of the law. The truth that doesn't fit into your neat little box of guilt and punishment." The words were deliberate, precise, each one calculated to land with the force of a hammer. Jasmine's eyes flicked toward Judge Posner, who, despite his usual impassive expression, now seemed more invested than ever. He was watching her carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jasmine took a deep breath and moved toward the jury. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, but it was a pressure she welcomed. The law is supposed to be a tool of justice. It's supposed to protect the innocent. But what happens when that very law becomes a weapon, a tool of oppression instead of protection? What happens when it's used to justify actions that harm people simply because of their status, their race, or their circumstances? She turned back to Walker. "You've built your case on the idea that your client's actions are unforgivable, that they somehow warrant a sentence based on moral superiority. But here's the truth, Mr. Walker, what you're really asking for is to punish someone for being a product of a broken system. You're asking the jury to ignore the fact that this defendant has been failed, time and time again, by that very system. There was a palpable shift in the courtroom. The tension thickened, but it wasn't just the usual courtroom drama. This was something else, something far more profound. Jasmine wasn't just defending her client. She was dismantling an entire system. And she was doing it with a calm precision that was making even the most seasoned observers question everything they thought they knew about this case. Walker's face was turning red now, a mixture of frustration and disbelief overtaking his earlier smugness. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine didn't allow him the chance. "I know your playbook, Mr. Walker," she said, her voice like ice. "I've seen it 100 times before. You distract with emotions. You manufacture fear. But you can't hide behind your legal jargon anymore. You can't ignore the truth just because it's inconvenient for you." She turned to the jury again, her eyes scanning each of them, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was saying. "The truth is that this trial isn't about right and wrong, it's about power. And if we allow that power to control the outcome, we all lose. We lose the very thing that makes us believe in justice. We lose the idea that the law is a shield for the weak, not a sword for the powerful." Jasmine paused, letting her words sink in. The courtroom was now utterly still. The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. It felt as if the entire world had momentarily stopped to hear what she had to say. Judge Posner's eyes were wide. His lips were parted, as if he had been caught off guard by the sheer force of Jasmine's argument. He was no longer just a neutral observer, he was a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of what was at stake here. And then, Jasmine did the unthinkable. She took a step back, a slight smirk crossing her face. "I think the jury understands exactly what I'm saying, Mr. Walker. The truth isn't always comfortable. But it's what we owe the people we serve. It's what we owe the defendant." Walker was speechless, his face pale. Jasmine had flipped the script. The courtroom was in stunned silence, but inside, Jasmine knew one thing: she had just delivered the blow that would make or break this case. The courtroom was still. The tension lingered in the air, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. Judge Posner sat motionless at his bench, his fingers resting on the armrest, his gaze still fixed on Jasmine Crockett. The reality of what had just transpired was settling over the room like a slow-moving storm. She had turned the case upside down in a matter of minutes, dismantling the prosecution's narrative with a surgical precision that left the courtroom in stunned silence. But outside, the world had already begun to react. Within hours, the internet was flooded with reactions. #Jasmine Crockett for President started trending, quickly gathering thousands of tweets and posts from people across the political spectrum. It wasn't just her legal brilliance that captured the public's imagination, it was the sheer conviction, the clarity of purpose she had displayed in that moment. She wasn't just defending her client, she was challenging the very system that had too long been a tool for the powerful to maintain control over the powerless. Celebrities took to social media, praising Jasmine for her unflinching courage. Filmmaker Ava DuVernay tweeted, "This is what real justice looks like." #Jasmine Crockett is a force. Actor Mahershala Ali, always a champion for social justice, shared his admiration in a video, saying, "When you see someone speak truth to power with that kind of clarity, it's not just about the case, it's about the future of our society." Jasmine Crockett is the future. As the reactions poured in, mainstream media outlets picked up the story. By the evening news, the trial had shifted from a legal proceeding to a national event, with the headlines no longer focused solely on the case itself, but on the force of nature that was Jasmine Crockett. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his broadcast with, "In a courtroom moment that will go down in history, Jasmine Crockett has not only delivered a masterful defense but a stunning rebuke of the very system she's working within." It wasn't long before political commentators and pundits joined the conversation. Rachel Maddow, known for her incisive commentary on matters of justice and equality, dedicated an entire segment to dissecting Jasmine's performance. What we saw today, Maddow said, her voice steady with admiration, was not just a brilliant legal mind at work. It was someone who understands the heart of the matter, that the law is meant to protect, not oppress. Jasmine Crockett is showing us what true legal reform looks like in action. But not everyone was thrilled by Jasmine's meteoric rise. On the other side, the prosecution's allies, the defenders of the status quo, scrambled to contain the damage. In the weeks following the trial, conservative commentators tried to downplay the significance of the moment, suggesting that Jasmine's words were nothing more than a political stunt, a cheap play to the masses. Fox News, in particular, criticized her for turning the courtroom into a political stage, questioning her commitment to the rule of law. But the public wasn't buying it. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForThePeople and #CrocketForChange flooded timelines. People from all walks of life, immigrants, activists, students, workers, shared their stories of feeling overlooked, oppressed, or ignored by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Jasmine's words had resonated with them on a level far beyond the courtroom. For many, she was no longer just a lawyer, she was a symbol of hope, a beacon in the darkness of a system that so often seemed stacked against them. The response from community leaders was equally profound. A month after the trial, Jasmine was invited to speak at a major rally for immigrant rights in Washington, D.C. The organizers were clear, her legal victory wasn't just a win for one individual, it was a win for every marginalized person who had ever felt the sting of an unjust system. At the rally, Jasmine was met with a hero's welcome, her speech interrupted multiple times by standing ovations. "We've been told to stay quiet, to accept what's been handed to us," she told the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of an entire movement. "But we're not staying quiet anymore. This fight isn't just mine, it's all of ours." Her rise was swift, but her impact was even swifter. Political figures from across the spectrum recognized the force that was Jasmine Crockett. Calls for her to run for office came almost immediately, but she deflected every single one. "Right now, I'm focused on justice," she said in an interview, her voice firm but humble. "This work, this fight for equality, is my calling, and I'm not leaving the front lines just yet." Despite her initial reluctance, the pressure from her supporters only intensified. Jasmine's name became synonymous with change. From local community leaders to the biggest names in media, everyone saw the potential in her, not just as a lawyer, but as a leader who could help redefine the future of justice in America. Back in the courtroom, the impact of Jasmine's words was equally undeniable. The jury had deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict of not guilty. It wasn't just a win for her client, it was a win for the principles of justice and fairness she had defended so fervently. As the news spread, people in the streets cheered, hugging and celebrating the outcome, while others quietly reflected on what it meant to witness such a decisive moment. Judge Posner, who had watched it all unfold, offered his own rare public statement after the trial. "What we witnessed here was a rare and powerful moment," he said. "It's not often that a trial leaves such a lasting mark. But this one has. Ms. Crockett has shown us what it means to truly fight for justice. And for that, I have the utmost respect." The case would fade into legal history, but the ripple effect of that courtroom moment? That would resonate for years to come. Jasmine Crockett had become not just a lawyer, but a symbol of something much larger, a fight for justice that refused to be silenced. The jury had spoken. The verdict was in. Jasmine Crockett stood in the courtroom, her client free, the weight of the moment still heavy in the air. For a brief second, the world seemed to stop, and Jasmine allowed herself to breathe, though the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But as she looked around the courtroom, at the faces of the jury, the spectators, the people who had placed their faith in her, it was clear that something monumental had just occurred. As the room began to settle, the murmurs fading, Jasmine turned to face Judge Posner. His expression, always measured, now carried an unspoken acknowledgement. He had seen many victories in his long career, but this was something different. This wasn't just a triumph of law, it was a triumph of values, of humanity, of truth. She stepped forward, taking a deep breath, letting the gravity of it all wash over her. There was no need for a grand speech, no need to gloat or bask in her moment of victory. Jasmine knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about the principles she had fought for, the ideals she had built her career on. And it was about the people who had been pushed to the margins, people whose voices had been silenced by a system that didn't see them, didn't hear them. This wasn't just a win for me, Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. This was a win for justice itself. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time it wasn't a tense, uncomfortable silence. It was one of recognition, of understanding. Everyone in that room knew, deep down, that Jasmine was right. This trial, this case, had been about so much more than a legal defense. It had been about standing up for the truth, even when the odds were stacked against you. It had been about reminding everyone, especially those in power, that justice wasn't a privilege for the few, but a right for all. Justice is not just about what happens in this courtroom, Jasmine continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with the jury, the prosecutor, the judge. It's about what happens outside of it. It's about the people we serve, the lives we touch. It's about making sure that the law works for everyone, not just the ones who have the money, the power, or the connections. It's about making sure that no one is ever forgotten. That no one is ever overlooked. That every single person gets a fair chance, no matter who they are or where they come from. Her words hung in the air, a call to action. The truth was, Jasmine wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. She was speaking to the world. And it was clear that the world was listening. The eyes of the public, the cameras, the commentators, they were all waiting for the next move, the next piece of this unfolding story. Jasmine's victory wasn't just a legal win. It was a message, a declaration that things could be different. We've heard so much about what's wrong with the system, she continued, her tone resolute. And we've heard about what needs to change. But change doesn't happen when we sit back and wait for it. Change happens when we stand up, when we speak out, and when we demand more from the institutions that are meant to serve us. Justice isn't passive. It's active. It's a choice we make every day. It's a choice to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it seems like the world is stacked against you. Jasmine paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She wasn't just talking about winning a case. She was talking about the future, about the kind of society they could all build if they were willing to fight for it. This isn't the end of the road, she said, her voice growing stronger. It's just the beginning. A beginning where we choose justice over complacency. Where we choose integrity over power. Where we choose to fight for the voiceless, the powerless, and the oppressed. Where we choose to make sure that every single person who steps into this courtroom is treated with dignity and respect. She turned back to the jury, her gaze softening for a moment. You've made a choice today, too. You've chosen to listen to the truth. You've chosen to see beyond the surface and dig deeper, to ask questions, to demand answers. And that choice matters. It matters more than you know. Jasmine's eyes flicked briefly to the prosecutor, who was standing at the back of the courtroom, his face still contorted with frustration. The battle was over, but the war for justice would continue. And Jasmine knew she would be at the front of it, fighting for the people who needed her the most. As she turned back to the judge, she offered a quiet nod. It wasn't just a nod of thanks, it was a nod of mutual understanding. Judge Posner had seen something today. He had witnessed not just a legal victory, but the dawn of something greater. Perhaps he, too, had been reminded of what justice truly meant. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, calm. "But this is just one case. The work doesn't stop here." And with that, Jasmine walked out of the courtroom, her client by her side, her head held high. The world outside was waiting, and Jasmine was ready. Ready to keep fighting for justice, for equality, for a future where the law was truly a tool for all. The trial was over, but the story? That was just beginning. As the dust settles from the courtroom drama, one thing is clear: Jasmine Crockett has shown us that justice isn't just a concept we read about in textbooks, it's a living, breathing force that can change lives, shift systems, and restore hope. Her victory wasn't just for her client, it was for every person who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or denied their right to fairness. This trial has reminded us that we all have a role to play in the fight for justice. It's not enough to sit back and hope for change. We must demand it. We must speak out, stand tall, and fight for what's right, no matter the odds. Because when we do, we not only change the course of one life, we change the future for all of us. So, if you believe in the power of truth, in standing up for what's right, in ensuring that justice is for everyone, then it's time to take action. Let Jasmine's example inspire you to be a part of the movement for justice. Share this video, spread the word, and let's make sure the world knows, justice is not just a dream, it's something we fight for every single day. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing up against injustice, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Join the conversation, be part of the change, and let's make sure that the truth always prevails. We can all be champions for justice, let's rise together.